Well, let's talk about some of those uncertainties. You mentioned the appropriations bills that they all run out in February 18th, and they're going to have to do full year appropriations. And as you said, that's still a question mark. Put a pin in that for a second, because
Right.
there's also what happens with the Build Back Better Act, which they're now talking about splitting up into other things. So that's a great uncertainty.
Right.
Let's going back to appropriations and uncertainties. I mean, one of the issues has been the disagreement over the size of the defense budget. And it strikes me that, recent events in Eastern Europe play into that, because if there's some sort of deployment of troops that haven't been deployed yet, put on alert, that could add spending pressure on the defense side. That might help break the logjam, but on budgets. But talk a little bit about the appropriations bills.
Sure. So, we've been operating under a temporary stopgap funding measure called a continuing resolution, which basically says the spending bills that we have in place for last year carry forward into this year. They do that to keep the government functioning while they negotiate full year appropriations for the fiscal year that we're in right now. There are 12 bills that they have to negotiate between the House and the Senate, Republicans and Democrats. These aren't pieces of legislation that you can cram into a reconciliation bill and pass with a simple majority. So you got to have Republicans and Democrats at the table. These are 60 vote measures. And you imagine you're having to negotiate, 12 different bills and all of the programs and agenda items that fall underneath those 12 different bills. And then all of a sudden, and a big chunk of those negotiations is the defense appropriations bill. And you have to consider the fact that whether rising tensions with Russia over Ukraine are going to affect negotiations for the defense budget. They might have nailed down a top line number, a couple of weeks ago. And there's a question now, I guess, we don't know whether or not these recent activities in Ukraine will change that number. Now, it's possible that instead of changing the top line number, what appropriators agreed to is to give the Defense Department a lot more flexibility underneath that number, that top line number, to move money around into different accounts. That's one of the ways to get around a constraining top line defense number, is just give the Defense Department more authority to move things around as they need. So we'll see what happens there.
Probably the last subject here for this segment, but there's been talk about splitting up the big Build Back Better bill that has had many iterations, but the form in which it passed the House is not going to pass the Senate. And so the question is, what then do Democrats do? But it's not that simple to just say break it up, because the whole thing has reconciliation protection, which means that it gets around the filibuster. If you start breaking it up, you can lose that, I guess. So explain what are the procedural hurdles that Democrats have to keep in mind as they go forward?
Well, I mean, you pretty much summed it up exactly right there, which is, Build Back Better was supposed to move under the reconciliation process as one giant bill. And that one giant bill had the protections of reconciliation, which meant that it could pass the Senate with a simple majority and not have to worry about a cloture vote or Senate filibuster. When you start breaking the Build Back Better up into individual pieces of legislation, it's not like each individual piece becomes its own little reconciliation bill. Okay, reconciliation applies to one bill and one bill only in this case. And so when you start breaking it up into pieces, for example, if they split off the child tax credit, the House does, and sends it to the Senate as a standalone piece of legislation, that's now a 60 vote measure. Okay, that becomes a bill in which Schumer is going to have to file cloture on in order to get on the bill, and would have to file cloture in order to get to a final vote. And so obviously you can see at that point, in the face of united Republican opposition to an expanded child tax credit, that the Senate would fail to get the 60 votes necessary. So at that point, you see that the strategy of breaking it up, Build Back Better, into individual pieces of legislation is not a recipe for enacting bills into law. It's a strategy it's a communication strategy. It's a way to show that the House Democrats are moving and grooving and passing legislation in the Senate, and that's the Senate and the Senate Republicans that are the problem. Again, it becomes a messaging strategy and not a strategy to enact laws. I sort of question the wisdom of that at this point. I mean, I know it's an election year. Midterm elections are looming high in everybody's radar screen, and they're very concerned about the outcome of the 22 elections. How Democrats in particular are very eager to show that they're out there working hard on behalf of the American people. But I really think at this point, Americans are looking for action, not talking points, and not communication strategies. So I think the president has said we're going to go back to the table on Build Back Better, and we're going to try and negotiate a new package with Senator Manchin. I think that's the right strategy.